Christ did exist and he did walk on water. And that is evidence enough for me. And within my realm of reason, it's not a rejection of reason. For me to do that, even if it goes against the laws of physics, I'm okay with that because I believe this man had power over the law of physics.
Everyone faces a choice point in their lives of, does this make sense to me, or do I just accept this? Like, mommy or daddy tells me, such and such, but I don't really understand. That doesn't make sense to me. How can you walk on water? Every time I step in the bathtub, I go straight to the bottom. So, what's going on here?
Yeah, yeah.
And
Christ in the scriptures, there's a man who said, "Hey, I've lived all the commandments my whole life. How can I gain eternal life?" And Christ says, "Sell all your riches, all your goods, and give all your riches to the poor, and come follow me."
I actually think that altruism can be used as a tool of exploitation. And I think and this ties into the issue of faith. Like, I don't think there is any good reason to give away all your possessions. Welcome to another episode of the Dan Norton Show. Today, I am here with Austin Wood. I met Austin on Facebook. I'm not sure when, sometime in the last few years. And recently, I put out a call on Facebook asking if any conservatives in particular, wanted to have a discussion or a debate. I haven't had many with conservatives. I've done a lot with people on the left, but not too many with conservatives. So I was interested in having some more discussions with them. And Austin said he was up for a chat. And so here we are. Welcome to the show.
Thanks, Dan. Appreciate you having me on here.
Sure thing. Okay, so let me throw out some topics that I had mentioned we might discuss. Faith and reason, egoism and altruism, taxes and regulations, and abortion. These are all topics that objectivism, which I subscribe to, Ayn Rand's philosophy, has a distinctive view on. And Austin being a conservative and Christian, would you say? Would that be accurate?
Very much
Okay.
so, yeah.
Okay, so we would probably have different views on these topics. And let's start out with faith and reason. I'm not sure if we'll get to all of the topics, but because this, I think, is the most fundamental issue among the ones I mentioned, I think it's a good one to start with. So let's start with faith and reason.
Dan, did you
And
did you want me to introduce myself? I think
oh,
you.
yeah, I'm sorry. Yeah, just for my audience, could you give a brief little intro about who you are, what you do?
Oh, sure, sure. Well, I am not a PhD in philosophy like Dan is. I respect you for that, Dan. That's great. I'm sure that that was an enjoyable PhD. I would have been interested in learning about that. I have an undergraduate degree in education, and I was a school teacher for a few years, and then I got a master's degree in business, and now I own my own real estate business. I like having deep conversations. I really love analyzing um, the problems of the world and the philosophies that help solve those problems. I'd like to be very somebody who's capable enough to help solve those world problems. And I am I do consider myself very religious. I am a member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, and as part of that church, I may have a little bit unique perspective than um, what other, yeah, let's see, other Christian sects would believe. Some different perspectives on that, but fundamentally, Christ is my Savior. He's the King, and I believe in His teachings very much, as long as they are interpreted correctly. And so there's a little bit about me. Yeah, yeah, that's a little bit about me, Dan, and hopefully um, we can have a good conversation today. I'm looking forward to it.
Okay, great. Thanks for that intro. I have had a few discussions with Mormons on my channel. It's been a while, but I know some of my early videos, or at least ex-Mormons, some are currently Mormons, some were also former Mormons.
Okay.
So anyone else wants to look more into that, just search on my channel. And also just let me put out a call for anyone watching this. If anyone else is interested in having a discussion on any philosophical topic, feel free to get in touch with me. I'm always looking for content for my channel, trying to grow it, get more subscribers. So feel free to reach out if you're interested in having a chat or know someone else who is. Okay. So let's now
Yeah.
get into, oh yeah, go ahead. Is
Yeah.
that something
One other
else?
thing I forgot to mention that I wanted to mention is I've read the book Atlas Shrugged, and I would actually say I'm quite partial to the philosophy of objectivism, and so um, so there may be some and I've kind of analyzed, okay, well, they're clearly in the Ayn Rand, they're clearly anti-faith in that, and a lot of the things really resonated with me in those regards, but I just wanted to bring up that actually I may not be directly opposed to some ideas. I really like objectivism, and much of what it's made of, but I'd be happy for you to challenge me on that if you have any ways to challenge me if you think I can't have two belief systems coincide in that way. So
Okay. Thanks for mentioning that. Yeah, I did want to know what your familiarity with Rand was. So you read Atlas Shrugged,
yes,
and
and I listened to
yeah,
the book also, Principles of Objectivism by Brandon,
okay.
Nathaniel Brandon. Yeah, I don't know if you've listened to that, but it's really really fantastic.
I've heard some of that in an audio version. Basic Principles of Objectivism was a course given by Nathaniel Brandon, who was one of Ayn Rand's students back in the 50s and 60s. He helped promote her philosophy, and he gave a lecture course on Basic Principles of Objectivism, which many years later was converted into a book called The Vision of Ayn Rand, I think. And I haven't read or heard all of the course. I've heard parts of it. But I know that's available on YouTube, I think, as a course if you want to hear it. Um, okay, and I do know there are just getting to your point about like different belief systems and how objectivism relates to Christianity. I know some people they call themselves Christian objectivists. I've heard I haven't I don't think I've met anyone like that myself, but I've heard like Yaron Brook, who's also a promoter of Ayn Rand's ideas, he's mentioned people tell him they're Christian objectivists. I don't think the views are compatible fundamentally, but I know there are people who like um, at least elements of both systems, and maybe we can discuss some of that today. And so let's get into the topic of reason and faith. So I think maybe a good place to start here is with a definition. Like, how would you define faith? I have in mind a particular definition, the way I think of it, but I'm interested to hear how you would define it.
Okay. I would say faith. I come from a perspective that is more practically based in how I view perhaps some of the principles, religious principles, and in terms of faith, I might say I believe it is a mindset that a person takes towards life, and it's a mindset that is very beneficial to people to live by. It's a mindset of acknowledging that you do not know all things, and that and actually there's um, that you know very little. And so you have to move forward in life with faith or believing that, recognizing that, and not putting too much trust in your own knowledge. A big part of faith is having faith in God and faith in Christ. And specifically, I believe that it is very useful to have faith in Christ because in terms of solving our problems, the more we the more we fundamentally trust ourselves and other people to fix our problems, I feel it actually can limit our abilities to actually solve our problems because we trust so much in what we currently know and not as much as what we do not know. And having faith in Christ enables us to believe that there is something beyond us that's greater than us, that know that there is a source of truth that helps us understand that there are solutions to our problems that we do not yet see, and that we can move forward and take steps towards solutions that actually help us um, find new solutions and new knowledge that completely benefit us. And I believe that the source of any knowledge, any truth, is God. And whether or not we acknowledge that it is God that is giving to us truth or knowledge that is truly benefiting us, that is truly giving us wisdom to lead our lives.
Okay. Let me give you a very brief definition, the way I think of it, and then
Okay.
we can go from there. So I can put it in three words. Faith is belief without evidence. That's how I understand faith. And uh, I think it might be helpful to have a very short and simple, easily to retain in one's minds understanding. Um, However, you might disagree with that, but we can talk about that. But just to give an example, let's say someone says, "Well, I saw this guy walking on water," and I might say, "Well, I don't believe you. I've never seen anything like that." Um, and then someone says, "Well, take it on faith." So that would be a way of saying like believe without evidence. Like even though you haven't seen anything like this yourself, I want you to just believe it without any evidence. So I think it that way of understanding what faith is, it's seems to jibe with the way it's used when someone says take it on faith. I think it often means even though you haven't seen reason or evidence to believe in something yourself, believe it anyways.
Yeah.
So that's how I think of faith, and I'm
Agreed.
curious what you think of that definition.
I, I think it's good. I think you make a good point, good points there. I think a question that I have is how absolute would that be? How, because most obviously you don't say, I mean, have you ever been to, let's say, Stanford campus, university campus?
I have.
You have? Okay. Have you been to BYU? That's where I went to for my Master's of Business program. Have you been to BYU?
I have. And actually, some of my videos are recorded on the campus of
Have
BYU.
you
That's where
been
I
to
met.
Arizona State University?
I think I've been at least to the town, Tempe, Arizona. I don't know if
Mm,
I've been on the campus, but
okay. I bet you I could do this one. BYU, Idaho. There's a university that is 25 minutes north of where I live. I live in Idaho Falls, and it's called BYU Idaho, and it's basically another branch of BYU,
okay.
and that's where I did my
I'm
undergraduate degree. Have you
yeah.
been to that university?
I have not been to there. I've never been to Idaho, so that's
Yeah, it's a really amazing place. Do you believe that the university's up there in Rexburg?
I believe there are, I don't know about Wexburg in particular, but if you tell me there is one, I don't have reason to think you are lying. It's not like telling me you saw somebody walking on water.
Good.
That conflicts with my knowledge of things like
Sure.
how the world works. But if you
So
just
it's
tell
not
me,
against reason. It's not against reason to believe it.
no, not in this case.
Right. And I would say that um th- and that was my question. How absolutely do you believe in what you just said? I don't believe in faith without evidence. Well, you really actually don't have evidence other than my word that BYU Idaho is in Rexburg, Idaho. And I could have been lying. I could have made that up off the top of my head, but you probably, it's more probable that you believe that exists. You could do a quick Google search or something. But my whole point is you do believe in things that you don't see, and reason doesn't necessarily go against that. And so I would say I share that same thing, that there is reason for me to believe a lot of things that I actually don't see or haven't seen the evidence of.
Okay, I would draw a distinction between belief without seeing and belief without evidence, because seeing is only one type of evidence. I mean, I can believe things that I hear. Like right now, I hear a truck driving around my neighborhood. I don't see it. I just did see it out of the corner of my eye, but I don't see it now. But I still hear it, and I believe that there's a truck there or some kind of a vehicle, not because I see it, but because I hear it. And as long as I have some form of evidence through some sensory medium or through the use of my logical reasoning capabilities, then I wouldn't call it faith. So in the case of hearing about some university campus, this is something which, unless I have reason to think you're lying or just making it up, then there's not. I wouldn't have reason to doubt it. But it's
Yeah,
not the sort of thing that's like if you told me you saw a three-sided square, I wouldn't believe that, or a person
sure.
walking on water. So
Sure.
I wouldn't call it faith at all to if I believe something like there's a campus in Idaho and a city called Rex something or other.
Rexburg, yeah.
Rexford.
Yeah, I would, and I can see your point of view on that, and recognize and it makes sense what you're suggesting, that this is perhaps a different, more specific way of faith, but you're saying most things that are anti-reason, or that most things, if you suggested something that is based in faith that really is anti-reason, then that's what you would probably say more is faith. Is that kind of what you're suggesting?
If it seems so, if there's no evidence for it, then I would say it's based on faith. And there could be different kinds of evidence, like the evidence of the senses, the five senses. There's also the evidence of just logical reasoning. Like, for example, um, 2 plus 5 is 7. Now that's kind of abstract, but I guess when you first learn it, you have to see it visually. Like you see two objects and five objects, and you put them all together, and now you can count seven objects. So even mathematics is sensory in a way, but if you get up to very large numbers, like 2 trillion plus 5 trillion, I would. How do I know that's 7 trillion? Well, I haven't like counted out trillions of things and visually verify this, but I've understood the principles of mathematics, which ultimately reduce to things that I can observe sensorially. So I can believe things through logical reasoning. So I wouldn't say it's a matter of faith that I believe 2 trillion plus 5 trillion is 7 trillion. It's because I've understood the logical principles of mathematics. I don't just believe it.
Yes. Yeah, and I think that's a good point. Um, and then so basically on that premise, you could say I can logically reason myself into believing that there is a university in Rexburg called BYU, Idaho. And your
Yeah.
reasoning potentially could be an error, and
Yeah.
that it could be you could be wrong, but you are able to believe that.
Yeah. Yeah. Reasoning you can make mistakes in reasoning, but at least there's an attempt at, like, I didn't just believe, I didn't just start believing for no reason at all that there's a BYU campus in Idaho.
You have
You've told me
somebody,
something about it.
and I told you, you have a
Yeah.
witness potentially,
Yeah,
somebody who's
otherwise it would be an arbitrary, what's called an arbitrary belief, in objectivism. If there's something, some proposition put forward for which there's no evidence, then it would just be arbitrary to believe it. Like if I suddenly believe there's a BYU campus in Kentucky without anyone having said anything about this, it would be arbitrary for me to believe that. Now, maybe it turns out that there is, um, for some strange reason, but it's still arbitrary in my mind. Now, someone else who knows about this campus and about the history of BYU, for in that person's mind, it would not be arbitrary to believe that there's a BYU campus in Kentucky if there actually were one. But in my mind, at least right now, it would be arbitrary to believe that, but not arbitrary to believe there's one in Idaho, since you've told me something about it.
right, right. And so you have a witness, and a witness can, I mean, obviously just one witness may not give good logical reason and enough supporting evidence that in for logical reasoning to assume that a campus exists. But if you have multiple witnesses potentially, and we know that a lot of people can be wrong about this, but multiple witnesses can also add to a person, if they have firsthand experience, they can add to a person's logical reasoning, and that they can assume, oh yeah, well, I also believe. Would you say that's true?
At least in some cases, yeah, having more people testify to something can more make it more plausible. But if it's something like, the Earth is flat, or, a bunch of people saw some guy walking on water, and not like with skis or anything, just normal human physiology, with no aids, it was walking on water, then I don't think that sort of thing, adds. I don't think there's increased credibility, when you have more people testifying to certain things, like those examples.
Yeah, because they're hard to believe because they go against some logical reasoning.
Yeah, I guess you could put it that way.
Yeah.
In experience that I've had.
Yeah, and in personal experience. And you have to recognize, embedded in my argument is you're limited 100% to your experience. And you're limited to your knowledge from that you've acquired from multiple different sources. And so there's an enormous amount of knowledge and understanding that exists outside of that knowledge. And that because of that, you have to you cannot logically reason yourself for things that are actually true. There are things that you would not be able to logically come to conclusions about and believe, unless you had more understanding for them for yourself. And so there's some threshold that you decide, like, okay, I just crossed the threshold. Okay, now is enough evidence for me to believe. Now is enough evidence. Okay, well, actually, this is a friend of mine, and he hasn't lied to me before, and he's telling me this. So now I feel like I have enough logical reasoning that I can conclude and I can believe.
Yeah, I mean, there's going to be a threshold for, depending on the type of knowledge in question, I'll need, more or less evidence for it. Um, so, if someone who's already trustworthy in my mind tells me something, then I might just believe it. I'll probably just believe it immediately. If it's nothing I have reason to doubt, like if my friend calls me and says, "I just got in a car accident," um, and he's not the type to play jokes or deceive, I'll just say, I'm sorry to hear that. It's too bad. I'll believe him. But if some random person who hasn't established their credibility to me tells me something, like someone comes up to me on the street and says, I've someone actually did this. She said she lost her wallet and her phone battery has died and she needs like $20 so she can make a call somewhere. Um, she made up some story, and this is someone just randomly approached me in a parking lot. I don't believe that person, or at least
Uh-huh.
I don't have the same level of belief as if my friend were to tell me the same thing.
Yeah.
So I'm going to need different amounts of evidence. Um, like I might just believe my friend just on him telling me something, but like if this with this random person who tells me her phone has died and her she lost her wallet, well, maybe I'll ask her to show me the phone, show me that she can't power it on. I won't just believe her immediately.
Yeah.
So if I wanted to investigate her claim, or I would need to investigate her claim more before I was ready to believe it's true.
Yeah. Well said. And my whole point there is Dan Norton's and Austin Wood's our reasoning and our reasoning is limited to the amount of knowledge and experience that we have in our lifetime.
In a way, I
Yeah.
mean, I can believe things based on other people's experience. Like I believe someone by the name George Washington existed. I didn't
Right.
experience him directly, but I've experienced reading books about him, and um, I have reason to think certain authors are trustworthy, and there's a chain that somehow links me back through the generations to George Washington. So in a way, I'm limited to my experience, but in a way, I can go beyond my experience if
Sure.
I can follow some kind of reliable chain that gets me somewhere else. But it ultimately has to come through my experience.
Well said. And I think my point here, and I think you would think that you would give a thumbs up to this, in as much as faith rejects reason, I do not believe that that is a good thing. And I believe our reason is a God given gift. But with that said, I also recognize that there is so much more for me to be known, to have for me to know that exists outside of my current experience and my reasoning. And because of that, I'm willing
Mhm.
to believe without seeing. And that doesn't mean I don't have some type of evidences. I may have some witnesses and I may have different things that actually have led me to feel more confident in my belief system, but it is not if you reject your reason and have faith. I do not adhere to that belief system. um, um,
Well, if you believe without, you said believe without seeing, I think it's probably,
or believe without evidence. Believe
yeah,
without evidence.
because there's other ways other than seeing that um, you can get evidence. So I think the difference between us is that well, you can tell me if this is a difference. I would say I don't believe without evidence, and I don't think one ever should. But would you say, at least in some cases, that you do believe things without evidence?
It depends. N- Based on your definition, no. I don't believe things without evidence because I have plenty of evidences that are before me, other people's witnesses, other people's experience, my own knowledge of other things that have led that may support the ideas. Um, there are other evidences that already exist that I can choose to assume or believe are credible. And with that, I can make a decision like, hey, yes, I do believe this. Now, that doesn't mean I there's degrees of belief too. Like I'm going to believe this much, but I'd like to verify it more myself anyways. So I still like, I'm not like going forward without saying I want more. I'd like to have more evidence of this. I'd like to, I would like to see Jesus walking on water. I would love to see that. I believe he walked on water, and I but I haven't had that experience myself. So I would say maybe my belief that he walked on water is this much compared to Peter, who walked on water with him, who has much more belief and even a knowledge that he has because he has much more evidence. And so, do you kind of see my argument there that there are different degrees and different types of evidences and that's kind of what you suggested too, and that there are different degrees of belief too that a person can have as a result. And I think it's also important to recognize that someone can put forward an idea and you can believe parts of that idea or all of the idea. You don't have to accept it all. So it makes it all much more complex, this idea of objectivism, which would like to make things all straight and hey, faith without evidence is, there's nothing good there. You reject any faith without any belief without evidence. And I just don't think that it's as clear cut as maybe a real absolutist um, objectivist would actually like it to be.
Okay. So it seems like maybe a few minutes ago, it seemed like you were saying you did not believe things without evidence, but now it seems like you're maybe pulling back a bit from that and saying it's not so clear. That's too absolute a thing to say. Now, I would say absolutely don't ever believe anything without evidence. Um, so I think so if you're not absolute on that, then I think there is a difference. Like if in some cases you are open to believing without evidence, then okay, now we've got a difference.
Well, and I hope you recognize why it's not absolute, because we just defined a whole bunch of different evidences that may not be really like great evidence. You have one witness that there's a BYU Idaho in Rexburg, Idaho. One witness. And obviously that's verifiable, and you can Google it real quick. But so there's different levels of evidence too, and that's why it's not so absolute. And you can't just lay it on like, oh, I can't believe without evidence. And I feel like it's almost a cop out and almost like putting too much trust in oneself, and like, oh yeah, I have the ability to be able to decipher great evidence and based on my experience and my logic and all my reason, when your reason and your experiences are also limited. And so anyways, I'm basically repeating my point, but I'm just saying that's why it's hard to be a true absolute. I don't i i don't believe without evidence, or I believe that, and I would say everything I believe in is with some level of evidence that I've found credible. So,
Okay, well, I wouldn't call that faith then, if there's some evidence. So there are different degrees of support you can have for some claim, like the claim that's this came up in a previous discussion I had, that a certain person committed a murder. Now, uh, if you know this person has a hatred of the person who was murdered, and he owns a gun, some kind of murder weapon he could use. So he's got a motive and a means, and let's say an opportunity as well. Let's say he lives in the same area as this person. Well, now you could say it's possible that he's committed the murder, but it's also possible he hasn't. We don't have enough evidence just based on that alone. But if we start getting more evidence, like we find his fingerprints at the scene of the crime, now maybe it becomes probable, not merely possible, that a certain person committed the murder. And then let's say we get even more evidence, like we find some camera footage of him actually committing the murder. Now we can go from it's merely probable to it's certain that he committed the murder. So there are different levels or amounts of evidence you can have for a certain claim, like so and so murdered so and so. But when I talk about faith and I say belief without evidence, that means none of that is present. So you don't know, you don't have any fingerprint, you don't have any video camera evidence, you don't know that he's got a gun, that he hates this guy, that he lives in the same area. You have none of that, yet you still believe that a certain person committed this murder. That would be believing it on faith, because that would be belief without evidence, meaning no evidence at all. So
Mhm.
that's what I mean by faith, and that's what I absolutely reject.
Yeah. Would you say in terms in would you say you are an atheist?
Yes.
You wouldn't call yourself an agnostic
No.
because you have enough evidence that suggests that
Hmm.
there is not a God and he that has created this world.
Yeah, given that conventional understanding of what God is, like an omnipotent being, omniscience, these omni qualities, he's said to have omnipresence. Given the kind of God that is traditionally meant when people say God, at least in the Western world, I think there is reason to deny that that sort of being exists, because there are these questions people raise, like, is God powerful enough to create a rock he can't lift? You get into contradictions either way you answer it. Like, he to be omnipotent, he has to be able to create the rock, but if he creates the rock, then he can't lift it, and if he can't lift it, he's not really omnipotent after all. Something like this.
Yeah.
So if you have reason to think that the characteristics attributed to God involve some kind of contradiction, then you can just rule it out and say, no, that's not possible.
So, but you're willing to accept that it's possible that you could be given extremely compelling evidence that could change your mind.
Not if it's for something contradictory. First of all, God has to be defined. So I think this is,
Sure,
um,
sure. I understand that. As a creator of the earth,
yeah, I mean, you could, if that's all you say, um, I don't think you can't rule it out just based on that. I think you need to
sure.
attribute other characteristics to God, like
Right.
omnipotence or so forth.
Okay. So, and I'm okay with that. But you're finding things that you have reason to reject the notion of God. And I'm okay with that. There's you have some good and you have arguments against why you've rejected that. But you also accept that you could be given evidence that surpasses that reasoning and you're like, "Oh, I was wrong here. I was wrong here about this." And my reason, just in my limited ability to and my limited experience, I didn't know that. Even though reason went against it, would you say that that's true? You could have evidence that could do that.
In this case, I don't think so. Now, in the case of the BYU campus in Idaho, I think I could be. I'm open to that.
Right.
Like if you tell me, maybe it turns out you were just making up this campus the whole time, and I'll discover that later if I look into it. So I'm open to the possibility that there is no BYU campus in Idaho. I'm not open to the possibility that maybe there could be a God as traditionally conceived with these omni qualities.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I didn't say, uh, but you're always open to more evidence.
For some things, but not for others. Like if someone says, maybe there could be evidence that A is not A, and you just haven't found it yet. The things are not what they are. The rocks are not rocks. that crackers are not crackers, right?
N-
You just have to wait around a little while, be patient, and maybe some evidence will show up that shows that things are not what they are.
I get what you're saying, but I'm saying evidence. I didn't say like some ideas that some. I'm talking about if new evidence came out that suggested an idea, and you would have to call it this is true because this is legitimately evidence. If I'm calling it evidence, it's evidence, right? You know, I wouldn't call it evidence otherwise. So you saying that you're rejecting evidence actually goes against reason in my mind.
I'm not
Now,
rejecting evidence,
and
but I'm rejecting that things can be evidence if they are claimed to be evidence for certain types of things, like
right, and
contradictions.
I get what you're saying, that you really don't believe that there is gonna be ever any evidence for a God, right?
As traditionally conceived, yes.
Yes, as traditionally conceived. Now, I'm suggesting that uh, apart from that, if you were given evidence and you knew it was evidence, you would accept it, even if as long as it basically debunks your other reasoning that you have behind it. Would you say that you'd accept that, right?
I mean, as long as it doesn't contradict um, things I know to be true, I'm open to it. So there
Right.
are just some things that's like in the case of God, I th I think it has to always contradict things I know to be true.
Yeah. Yeah, and I understand. And all I'm suggesting is if those things you know to be true automatically became like, oh, they're gone. Like that reasoning's gone because I have this and it's way bigger than that. In that case, it sounds like you'd be willing to accept this new evidence.
If it contradicts something I know to be true,
No, if it actually overturns something that you know to be true.
well, in that case, I guess what I thought I knew to be true, actually I didn't know to be true, um, which I don't think is possible with something like the law of identity or A is A. So, and I think God, as traditionally conceived, conflicts with that principle because he
Yep, and,
involves.
and I'm okay with that argument. I'm okay with the idea that there's reason for you to believe that there isn't a God and that it doesn't exist, as long as you're willing to accept that if you were given evidence that refuted your reasoning and made you feel like, oh, it's wrong, then you would overturn that and you say,
Yeah,
okay,
yeah.
yeah. And so does that mean you're an agnostic?
No, I don't see why that would make me an
I'm
agnostic.
just saying because if you had more evidence that suggested that God existed, but I
Yeah,
and
but see, I'm
and,
not open
and
to the possibility of that evidence. Like an agnostic is someone who's kind of on the fence. That's the way I think of it, at least. Like he's not sure. Maybe it can be thought of like the murder case I brought up several minutes ago. Like if you're at the stage where you think, well, maybe he committed the murder, maybe not. I
mhm,
need
mhm.
to wait for more evidence to come in before I can decide. Right now, I'm undecided. That would be
Yeah,
the agnostic position, but I'm not in that position with regard to God as traditionally conceived. Right now, I'm saying no. I've made up my mind. I'm certain there is no God. I don't need any more evidence.
yeah,
Based
and
on the
I'm
nature
okay.
attributed to him, I'm my mind is made up.
I'm okay with that. I'm okay with that. I'm sure some agnostics would take some issue with you calling them fence sitters. They would probably say, "No, I just need more evidence." I don't believe it, but I would just need more evidence because I think most agnostics say, I don't believe in a God unless I had more evidence. But I'm okay with I'm all right with your argument that you say, you know what, I've already decided there isn't a God, so I really am an atheist, and it's more of a little tease or a game to say, oh, actually, Dan, I think you're an agnostic. So,
Okay. Um, yeah, so I don't mean the idea of a fence sitter. I don't mean that's necessarily a bad thing. I just mean someone who hasn't made up his mind yet. And that's how the agnostic is. He hasn't made up, or she hasn't made up her mind yet about the issue of God. Now, I might be able to have a discussion with someone who's an agnostic and persuade the agnostic that there couldn't be evidence for such a thing. So there's nothing you need to wait around for, given that this thing involves contradictions. And maybe I could persuade someone that they should actually be an atheist because there's no evidence to wait around for. Um, but if you don't see it that way, if you haven't been persuaded of that point of view, then I can see how you could hold an agnostic position. And I actually used to be one many, many years ago before I learned about objectivism and its arguments for atheism or why atheism makes sense. I would have called myself an agnostic for, I don't know, maybe a year or two. But that was before I learned the arguments that I'm now aware of. So now, given my current state of knowledge, I think atheism makes more sense to me.
yeah, and at one point I want to make that I support your belief system on. I assume that this is part of your belief system. Is I don't believe in mysticism. I don't believe in. I do feel that there's this high degree of, like it's religion without reason. It's really living a life of like my family. I have family members who are actually in the funeral business. They're funeral directors, and I heard a story about this lady who she had breast cancer, an elderly lady, and she said, God, her friend said, go, go, you need to go to the doctor and get that checked. She said, no, God will heal me. God will heal me. He's like, you need to go get it checked. And you know what killed her? Breast cancer. And I believe that would be mysticism. To have this irresponsible belief in God, and it's a counterfeit. I don't even believe it's a true belief in God. I believe it's a counterfeit. And no matter how much conviction they say, I believe people who do not really have a responsible view and are honest about their belief in God. I just think it's counterfeit. And so I guess in those regards, I'm actually all for objectivism's ideas and their attacks against mysticism.
Okay. So, uh, I'm not sure how I would define mysticism, but however it's defined, I would say a characteristic of it is being anti-reason, not going by reason. So it's at least
Just so
it's
you know, I'm sorry to interrupt, Dan. That was a term I took from Nathaniel Brandon. From
yeah, I know that term does appear in the objectivist literature, and I was just thinking of looking into
and I think it might even be.
um,
Is it also in Atlas Shrugged? I'm not sure if it actually uses that term or not.
she uses the terms mystic of muscle and mystic of spirits in Atlas Shrugged, and maybe also the term mysticism is in there. I'm not sure, but it's definitely in Leonard Peikoff's book, Objectivism: The Philosophy of Ayn Rand. This was her student. He wrote a summary of her philosophy, and there's a section in there on mysticism and how it's a rejection of reason along with skepticism. Um, I was just thinking about looking up what he says in there about mysticism, but maybe it involves faith. Mysticism and skepticism as denials of reason. That's the subsection in this book. But anyways, I think mysticism is at least close to faith as a concept. I don't know if they're identical concepts.
I think they're equated with faith quite frequently. Um, as long as you I mean, I think Nathaniel Branden and Ayn Rand use that term to kind of separate. I don't know why they. I mean, she directly says faith, hope, and charity. She rejects that in Atlas Shrugged. She actually says that directly. So she actually says the word faith, but in it. And anyways, my opinion is that there is some rejection of faith directly there. But as long as faith is defined as mysticism, which I would argue it's likely that Ayn Rand would say that faith is mysticism. So
I'm not sure about that. Maybe at least close. I don't know if she would say it's identical, like just a synonym. It may have some shade of meaning that makes it slightly different. But I
or
think it's
just a
safe to say she would reject
category.
both faith and mysticism, whether or not
Sure.
they're identical. Um, but you would, I guess, as a Christian, you would not reject faith. However, you've said you, at least that sometimes you've said you reject belief without evidence, which I equate with faith, since that's how I define it. So if it's true that you reject all belief without evidence, then I would say you do reject faith.
So I would argue, I would go back to my original description here, is that we have this much knowledge and experience, and outside of that there exists much more, and you can give me reason to believe that there is something more that exists outside of my current experience and knowledge. And I believe that believing in stuff that are outside of my current set of reason and my knowledge and my experience can be equated to faith. And that's my argument.
Well, I think whether I would agree to that depends on how we're understanding this belief in things outside your experience. Like, for example, um, there are people I've never met in Africa who I believe exists. Now, are they outside my experience? Well, at least in a way they are. I mean, I've never met them personally, um, but I have reason to think these people are, that there are such people I've never met, but I wouldn't call that faith. So I think maybe it's better to use the example of a case where we differ. Like you said that you believed Jesus walked on water. Now, I think for both of us, well, at least for me, I can say that's outside of my experience in a way different than the people who are in Africa that I've never met are outside my experience. Um, Jesus walking on water is outside my experience, but not only um, it's not just that I haven't happened to see this person as I haven't happened to see many people in Africa, but my understanding of how physics works, even if I haven't taken a physics class, just my experience with the world. Like I know that like if I step into a bathtub full of water, I don't rest on the surface. My feet go down below the surface. And this happens to other people. It's not just me, if I go to a beach and I see people running from the shore into the water, they don't remain on the surface of the water. They go underneath it. um, at least if they're in the walking position. Now, if they lie down, they can float on the water, but they can't just walk on the water like I walk on land. Yet you believe that some guy did this. So, um, what's going on there? Now, if I were to believe someone actually walked on water, that would have to be, I would describe it as a belief based on faith. Because I don't think I don't have evidence that someone can do this.
Sure.
Now, would you say you do have evidence that someone can do this, or would you say you believe that someone did this without any evidence?
So again, I would say it has to do with what type of evidence. Do I have evidence that I saw him for myself walking on water? No, I can't say that. Can I say that I have people who have witnessed to me that they believe that it has occurred? Do I have witnesses in written? Just like you said, you've read books about George Washington and you believe he really existed. I've read about accounts about witnesses of Jesus Christ walking on water. And because I have also verified for myself other things that these witnesses have told me and believe that these fundamental ideas are really based in truth, it is easy for me to then make the logical or reasonable connection that, well, I've accepted all of these ideas that they've given me, and I really have seen fruit in my life, evidences in my own life that would really lead me to believe that, yes, while implausible, while seemingly outside of our reasonable mind, outside of the laws of physics, I do believe that it occurred, that Jesus did walk on water. And so I do it based on evidences. It's the same evidences or similar evidences in nature as those of you believing that George Washington existed. And
Okay.
I know you have reason to say, well, I don't have any reason to believe that George Washington didn't exist. There's no reasonable arguments. And then you can also make the argument, well, I do have reasonable arguments to say that Jesus didn't walk on water. He couldn't walk on water. And I'm okay with that. But it is reason enough for me to believe that yes, Jesus Christ did walk on water.
Okay. So the I'm wondering if you have evidence that he walked on water, or if this is um like if what you're calling evidence is what I would call evidence. Like maybe that's maybe we have a difference there. Like you say you've heard people testify to this. You didn't see him walk on water yourself,
And there's
but
written accounts like the
you've
New Testament. There's
okay.
there's written accounts of it.
Okay. So you've read in in the New Testament that he walked on water, and that's I mean, is that
Is that my evidence?
well, yeah, that's one question. Is that enough for you, just that it's written, or what more do you need? Because, obviously you can write anything in a book. You can write about dragons and
Sure. Sure.
all kinds of fictional things.
Well said. Well, one thing different than dragons and Christ is you have, not saying that this is evidence in of itself, because you have witnesses on the other side, but an enormous amount of people who believe this happened, who through their own reasoning powers came to conclusions for themselves that yes, Jesus existed, and not only did he exist, he performed miracles, including walking on water. So that's one type of evidence. Another type of evidence, yes, is I've read it. Another type of evidence is I've lived a Christian lifestyle, and I'm striving to continue to live a Christian lifestyle. And as I've lived by the words of Christ, I believe that I have seen miracles, things that have occurred that I would call miracles in my life. And so that leads me to believe further that yes, that Christ did exist and he did walk on water. And that is evidence enough for me. And within my realm of reason, it's not a rejection of reason. For me to do that, even if it goes against the laws of physics, I'm okay with that because I believe this man had power over the law of physics. And I have had enough personal experiences for me to lead me to believe that I would actually call um, good enough evidences for me to believe it.
So part of your evidence, you said, is many people believe that he walked on water. So it's not just one person who testified this, but um, I mean, should that really does that really hold much water, carry
Uh,
much weight?
I
Maybe I'm
agree. I agree that that
uh,
alone is not evidence enough. I don't believe in the religion of Islam. I don't believe in that Allah is my God. And and by golly, there's a huge number of people who believe that. A huge
yeah.
number of people that believe that. And but I would also say I'm open to being told wrong, that I'm open to finding out that I'm wrong. I'm open to having evidences actually uproot my belief system, even if I had compelling evidences enough to uproot my belief in Christianity. That said, like you in atheism, I strongly believe that that will never happen. And and so yeah, I recognize your argument that just because a lot of people believe it doesn't mean it's true. But do a lot of people, like in the millions, believe that there are fire-breathing dragons? The answer is no. The reasonable answer is no. People don't really believe that, and so there's some credibility that lends some credibility to it, that perhaps that there is more soundness in this idea. There's a possibility, but it's not just based on that. It's based on my personal experiences. It's based on me reading the words of Christ and then practicing them. And as I live by them, I see fruits in my life. And I've experienced it in a way that I'm like, this is not something that I can reasonably say is just luck, or is just that Christ's teachings are just happen to be, he's just a really wise man that nailed
Mhm.
it, and so that's why I feel like I have reason enough to believe that Christ walked on water.
I want to go back to the dragon versus. So you say that millions of people don't believe in dragons, yet millions of people do believe that Jesus walked on water. So doesn't that show that dragons are less plausible than Jesus walking on water? I think we need to ask why, or at least that's where my mind goes. Like, why is it the millions of people believe in one thing but not the other? And I think it could just be that, well, there, maybe there are multiple reasons here, but at least one reason is just given historical accidents. Like, why did certain mystery cults become just go extinct thousands of years ago? But Christianity, which I've heard just described as one mystery cults that came from the Near Eastern region, um, it happened to win out, and there might be, I mean, part of it could be the use of force. Like, if you could stamp out heretics by burning them at the stake, it's not safe to believe certain ideas once they gain state power. And so that certainly gives a lot of people reason to, at least nominally, say that they believe a certain religion, because if you don't, you could get killed. It could be very
Sure.
hazardous to your health. So
Yeah.
maybe that's the reason
Yeah,
that's
and I think another argument you could make that adds to what you're suggesting is tradition.
yeah.
Tradition is the biggest thing that carries beliefs, false beliefs or true beliefs from generation to generation. Tradition is huge. And so there's another argument that could be made against Christianity that I acknowledge.
Yeah, I think a lot of people, they don't think for themselves, and they are afraid to question the beliefs they were raised with. Like, if their parents are raised them as a Christian or a Muslim or Hindu or whatever, and they know that they will be ostracized from their family if they believe something different, and that might make them feel uncomfortable, and they don't want to go through with that. And so and they don't have the courage. I mean, some people do, and they do think for themselves, and they break away from the religion they were born with. But I think for a lot of people, maybe the vast majority, they don't have the courage to think for themselves and risk undergoing the social ostracism that can come with that. And so they end up just believing whatever they were raised with. And then that goes on for generation after generation. And you end up with millions or billions of people um, believing the same thing, not because they independently saw good reason to accept these beliefs, but that just because they were too scared to question them.
Well, I mean, you can even think about like the time of not Socrates, what's the other big philosopher behind objectivism that was huge for objectivism?
Aristotle?
Aristotle. Let's see, was it Aristotle who was killed because of his liberal thinking here, telling basically helping people learn to think for themselves?
You're thinking of Socrates, I think.
Socrates. Okay, so
Yeah.
Socrates is teaching people to think for themselves, and he gets killed for it. And you can really look at like the Renaissance was so huge because it says you can think for yourself. And so there's another big argument against it is against potentially Christianity is pre-Renaissance, you didn't even have permission to think any other way. You would die if you don't. And one of the world's greatest philosophers was killed for it. Can't think for yourself. Thank heavens for the US Constitution that helps protect that more fully, to think for ourselves, and believe what we feel is in the dictates of our heart, that we can believe.
Yeah. And actually, yeah, I think that was more of a turning point, the U.S. Constitution, than the Renaissance, because there were still, you had the Reformation after the Renaissance, and then you had Catholics and Protestants slaughtering each
Sure.
other, um, in wars that went on for decades, 30
Well,
Years War.
I'm not a historian, and I won't argue that I'm really intelligent about these types of things. But I agree with you that and we can see that there is an opening up of freedom of thought that has come over these time periods, and hopefully we can preserve that in the eyes of people who are trying to censor and stop you from being able to believe what you want, or to quiet you and say no more, you can't do that. That's it's scary, honestly. It's scary.
Well, I think we what's good is to have a culture of reason. And Ayn Rand has an article called "Faith and Force: The Destroyers of the Modern World," and on her view, those two go together, faith and force, whereas reason and freedom also go together. So if if you just go by faith, you have no means to rationally adjudicate things with other people. So if someone disagrees, you just have to resort to force because there is no rational argument to convince someone if you're just going by faith. So you end up having to deal with others by force if you do go by faith in epistemology. Whereas if you have an epistemology of reason, now you have a peaceful means of persuading someone to your viewpoints. You don't have to resort to force. Um, so uh, this is an area
Which
where I
calls into question, like, we've had a few generations since the Constitution was formed and protected freedom of religion and freedom of our own belief systems, you know, and unfortunately, in my opinion, there's a decline in religion. People who are adhering to religion and Christianity, there's a decline in the spirituality of individuals, and they're focusing more on, pure. They argue that science is is what you need to put your faith in, or your belief system in, I guess I should say. And I would say science and religion, um, as long as the religion is true,
ah
is
uh,
teaching truth.
okay. Yeah, so I think those are incompatible, science and religion. Um, but I think I feel like we're drifting in a somewhat different direction with the conversation. We've started to get into politics a bit,
Sure.
which maybe is a good thing. Maybe we should go there, but um, I want to, I'm not sure we wrapped up the issue of faith, at least to
And
my satisfaction. I wanted to
could
at
I
least get a little more into it.
could I just say, and maybe we're not there, but my opinion is, that, do you, maybe I'll ask this question. Do you agree with me that I can have experiences and knowledge that lead me to have reasonable arguments for things that I believe that you would not believe, that you do not have the knowledge and experience to also say that this works and this is truth?
I think you could have that about some things, but not about others. I don't think you have good arguments, or at least I haven't heard any yet that I would consider good arguments for believing that someone can walk on water. Now, I'm sure you have other experiences and arguments to believe all kinds of other things, like there's the BYU campus in Idaho, which I don't doubt you have good arguments for. But when it comes to this particular claim, I don't think you have experiences that I think justify a belief in that. So actually, that's where I wanted to go back to this example. You started giving reasons to think why it's more plausible to why you do have some evidence. Like you said, many people, millions of people believe in that, but not things like dragons. And so then we started unpacking that idea. Like, is it really valid or relevant that many people believe it? Could it just be that they believe it out of inertia? Like they're just out of
Sure.
tradition, as you said, they're just inheriting these beliefs and or they're believing them because of threats of force. They could be persecuted if they don't believe these things. I think these sorts of explanations are plausible as to why there are so many people who believe or at least claim to believe that someone walked on water. So I think if we go through your reasons for accepting this belief, that it will likely turn out that there's really there aren't grounds for it. Um,
I think that that's where, let's just use the scientific process as an example. Let's say that Albert Einstein performed an experiment where he claims that he split the atom. And I'm sure you believe it that he did do that.
I don't doubt it. I mean,
Yeah,
I don't know if he personally split the atom, but maybe he came up with the theory that allowed other people to figure out how to do that.
yeah,
I don't
yeah.
know much about the physics of that.
So I imagine that when he first made a claim to that, that most people said did not carry out an experiment themselves to actually split the atom. And they did not, that they would, and there's probably a lot of people who would like, I'm not going to believe this until I have that same experience, and then there was obviously big enough reasons to believe, creating the atom bomb, that gave evidence enough to believe, well, maybe this is legitimate. This is actually real, what he's created here. Now, my argument is Albert Einstein went through a process and an experience before anybody else did that led him to believe he could split the atom, or he actually did split the atom. I don't know. I don't know it either. I would argue the same thing about spiritual things, that I can have spiritual experiences and that I have had legitimate experiences that some other people might explain off as emotional experiences, or they're like experiences like being on mushrooms or other types of drugs, psychedelic experiences that are just in your brain processes. But I would argue that I have had personal experiences, that I've gone through specific steps myself and have actually had evidences, clear evidences for me, that you have not yet had, and that you may never have unless you follow the same process. And if you didn't know that an atom bomb had been dropped, and pre-atom bomb or pre visual evidence, you may not believe Albert Einstein had actually figured out how to split the atom. And so my argument is, individuals can have all kinds of different experiences and have reasonable explanations for their belief systems. And it's not just merely a denial of reason that has led them to have faith, and that's their faith.
Okay, so you're analogizing Einstein's experience or maybe thought experiment. I'm not sure exactly what it was of splitting the atom. You're analogizing that to your experience that leads you to believe someone can walk on water. Now, I don't, at least so far, I haven't seen good reason to analogize those. Um,
Well, let me ask you this, and unless you're still continuing my thought, didn't mean to interrupt you.
I had Yeah, I was going to say something, but I forget what it was. So you can go ahead.
Okay. I think most people in the during the lifetime of Albert Einstein, if they had heard that somebody figured out how to split an atom, it would have been far beyond their reason. This is absurd. It's far beyond reason. And and that doesn't mean it didn't happen and that it's not true, but it was beyond their individual reason, and that they might be able to follow a process or see some evidences that would lead them to believe that, oh, it happened. Albert Einstein did split the atom. All I'm arguing is the analogy there is I can have an experience by following a process that leads me to have a reasonable belief that something exists like Jesus walked on water. While you don't have those same experiences, you have a totally different knowledge base, experience base that leads you to believe fundamentally couldn't happen. Just like somebody else would not believe that the atom could actually be split.
Hmm. I remember what I was going to say before. I just want to bring in the term package deal. I thought that's what was going on in putting together Einstein's thought experiments with the sorts of experiences that you claim to have that lead you to believe someone could walk on water. I think that's probably what Ayn Rand would call a package deal, putting together things that are essentially different. But if they are essentially different, then exactly how are they essentially different, such they shouldn't be analogized? I think that's what I'm interested in exploring now. Like, are these really? Is there an analogy here, or are these, or is it, or are they not analogous? I don't see them as analogous, but
I'm only using them analogous that somebody can be have a reasonable belief that the atom cannot be split. And people most certainly did at that time. Like, no, the atom cannot be split. This scientist guy, even if he said it, no, the atom cannot be split. All I'm saying is different people can have different beliefs that are reasonable, and that if they follow the exact same process, they could come to the same conclusion as Albert Einstein did. And all I'm arguing is I can follow a process that I believe is a true process that leads me to have spiritual convictions that are reasonable, that are based in reason, that make me think, you know what? Christ walked on water. And that's all I'm saying. That's the analogy there. And I don't know fully what your attack on that is, why they can't be an analogy. But all I'm saying is, yes, that's that people can have different experiences and not believe, and go through different processes to believe it.
okay. So in the case of splitting the atom, I don't know why someone would say that's not possible. So I mean, it just,
Today it's reasonable to say that.
well,
People,
even like, well, and if you go by the ancient Greek idea of an atom, literally what it means is uncuttable. Atome. I think tome was the verb for cut.
oh,
So
interesting.
so an atom was something you could not cut. And
Interesting.
if you just define it as something you can't cut, then like by definition, you can't cut the atom.
Right, right.
But historically, what have been called atoms turn out to not be atoms. They have subatomic particles, electrons, neutrons, protons, and then you could break it further down into quarks and
Works. Yeah.
neutrinos, and I don't know all the the latest
I don't know
particle
either.
names, but anyways, in Einstein's day, I don't think there was, I'm not aware of evidence that you could not split what was then considered to be an atom. So I don't know when, like, well, there's a question of what, like, can you split it given current technology, or only if you have more high powered, like, particle colliders, accelerators to break apart uh, certain particles into smaller particles. Um, so I think this was sometime around 1900. I know he wrote some famous paper in 1905. I don't know if that was his theory of relativity, special or general. Um, but anyways, just to make it simple, we can just say 1900. So at that time, uh, I guess I don't know if I think the neutron wasn't discovered till the 30s, 1930s. Um, but so there was an idea, I guess they had an idea of a nucleus, but they didn't know the parts that made it up. Anyway, I don't want to get too deep in the weeds of physics that I'm not aware of and that doesn't really matter to the issue, but um, I don't know now that people in, let's say, 1900 had good reason to think that the smallest particle they were then aware of in 1900 could not someday be um, divided into smaller parts.
I mean, the fact that the name of Adam meant you cannot split it, you cannot, what did you say, cannot cut it?
Yeah.
At least at one time, they believed, and they would probably assume with great reason, that the atom could not be split. And so I know you're suggesting that maybe around the time of Albert Einstein, well, maybe we can. And they became more open minded to it as they received more evidence that this can be done. But at one point, it was outside of reason to believe that. And so I think it's just important to recognize that what's within the realm of reason can very quickly change sometimes.
Uh, well, I'm not sure that that's being illustrated given this example. Like this idea of an atom as something uncuttable goes back to the ancient Greeks. So Democritus, he was a ancient Greek philosopher. I don't know if he was the one who I think he's considered one of the founders of the atomic theory, not like a modern scientific atomic theory, but the ancient Greek idea that there are these little tiny things that make up everything else. So one of the themes in Greek philosophy and science in its early days was they were looking for what's called the one in the many. So you have all these things in the world, bananas and rocks and ships and wax, but they can all be the idea was that there's something in common between all these diverse things. It's not just that there's banana stuff and there's rock stuff and there's wax stuff and they're just irreducibly different. Rather, um, there are one or maybe a small number, a few basic building blocks. And then if you put these building blocks into different combinations, you get all the different sorts of macro objects that we see in the world, bananas and rocks and ceiling and wax and so forth. Um, so I think Democritus was one of the early proponents of this idea that's, um, well, I mean, Thales had I think his view, it was everything was water. He thought water was like the world stuff that was composing everything else. And you had, I guess, some of his evidence. Well, I don't know if this was his or, anyways, I've heard Leonard Peikoff in his history of philosophy course talk about how the transitions from like water to ice to gas. shows that um, the same thing can take different forms. And somehow Democritus, I guess, picked up on this idea, but maybe give it some kind of tweak that the same thing can constitute different objects. Anyways, there's some fundamental building block that was Democritus's idea, and he called these atoms. And I guess this was inherited by Epicurus and maybe some other philosophers who had similar ideas. And I guess as science and time progressed through the millennia, they had different ideas of what are the fundamental
Mhm.
things that make up the universe. And now we've got the periodic table of elements. So there's like 100 or 150, or I don't know exactly how many things that are considered to be basic building blocks, but those are just in the realm of chemistry. At a more fundamental physical level, there's not 150 or however many elements. There's three, right? There's electrons, protons, and neutrons. But as science progressed even further, they now have a different roster of fundamental particles. So I mentioned before the quarks and neutrinos. So I don't know what the current fundamental roster of particles is, but there's some roster, and I guess as science develops, there's that roster can change. And I guess if you have a certain view, you might think that there's not even particles at all. There's just a plenum, what was called a plenum in ancient Greece, um, meaning the universe is just solidly packed. There's no there's no space. There is no nothing. That was one of Parmenides' ideas. He was another ancient Greek philosopher. So I, I guess from a certain perspective, maybe this is true that there are no particles. If you think that means like things that are fundamentally discontinuous, it might be that the universe is just this plenum, uh, and I guess we divide it up through we experience it as discrete things, but in reality, maybe it's not discrete. Um, so, anyways, we're getting really deep into
Yeah,
like
I'm
some
impressed with your
metaphysics and
knowledge, Dan. You've retained quite a bit of data in your mind that, I hear a few things. I'm like, oh yeah, I remember that in my chemistry class, but there's a lot that you know there.
well, I've I mean I've studied a lot of history of philosophy and also some science over across many years, so I've picked up a fair number of things. But I guess the
You're,
challenge now is to see if I can tie this all back to our discussion of faith
oh,
and reason and bring it all to bear. And so it's not just an end in itself that I'm going into all this. It's
I
for the
see. Yeah.
purpose
Yeah.
of shedding light
Well,
on this. So we were talking about
it sounds like your argument is that
um,
um, that that maybe the atom, even though they didn't think it was cuttable, they were just put. It was more of a use of a general use of the name atom as the
it
smallest
was kind of a theoretical
theoretical
concept.
idea
Like
rather than an actual idea, an actual belief. You know.
so they didn't have experience of like they didn't even have microscopes in ancient Greece. So they
Yeah,
can't even see things that are smaller than like, whatever the smallest thing you can see is with your eye, a breadth of a hair, maybe a tiny piece of dust. So any idea they had of atoms, it was just kind of it was a theory. It was a conceptual
that makes sense.
framework
That
for,
makes sense.
and as science has progressed, we've actually been able to investigate this and make it more than just a theory. So now, I think you can actually see individual atoms. I mean, in a sense of see. I mean, you can use certain. I think it's there's something called an electron microscope, which I don't know if that allows you to see electrons, but there's also an issue of like what is the wavelength of light and like There's a certain limits that you can have for detecting certain things, which is set by the wavelength of the whatever you're bouncing off the thing you're trying to see. Um, so, anyways,
Yeah, so you're basically saying that perhaps in the realm of reason, perhaps it was always in the realm of reason that an atom could be split, even though at the time that they didn't have a microscope, they couldn't have really fathomed that. They couldn't have really known what that actually meant. It was more of a theoretical idea that there was a sub particle that could not be split. Is that kind of what you're suggesting?
maybe it's. I mean, I think let's see, like today, um, I guess it's. I don't know if I would say it's an open question as to whether the universe is a plenum or is made up of particles or waves or fields or forces. Um, but anyways, I guess the um, the idea that what was called an atom, like you might not even know that the etymology of the word that it meant uncuttable. So, so you can't even make that argument if you don't know the etymology. So whatever they called an atom, I don't even know if Einstein knew the etymology of the word.
Yeah,
They just knew that atoms were these very small things that made up other things.
sure.
So whatever was the smallest thing they were aware of at his time, let's just say 1900, I don't think they had a reason to say, well, we can never find something smaller than that. Um, they might have thought it could be very difficult, but impossible. I don't think they had grounds to take that step.
Sure.
But in contrast, I I don't think that like if we're saying uh is it possible for a guy to walk on water like in the year 1900, should people have been open to that as a possibility in the way that I think they should be open to the possibility that maybe we'll one day find something smaller than what we now in 1900 call an atom? No, I don't think people should have said in 1900 it's possible that someone can walk on water in the way that I think they should say it's possible that we'll one day find a smaller particle than what we now call an atom.
Hmm. How about we wrap up in another 10 minutes? Is that all right, Dan?
Yeah, sure.
Um, do you want to keep going down this route a little bit more? Or should we I don't know if we came to a conclusion here yet.
Well, we've talked about it a long time, and I'm happy that we've covered a lot. We've gone in depth into this more than I've done in previous of my episodes, so I'm glad we got to cover a lot of new territory. So I'm content. If you want to go to a different topic, I'm happy to do that. I appreciate you coming on. So I want to kind
Sure.
of like thank you for participating by giving you the choice of last topic.
Sure. Yeah, I wouldn't mind to talk about altruism a little bit, and egoism. I find them very fascinating and have come to love some of the concept a little bit more. I believe, and I'll just make this some points here, and I probably, well, in some ways, would guess that I agree with you very much, and just the same as faith and reason, there's other ways that we would probably disagree. I believe altruism in its definition of just giving of yourself and your resources um, freely without any expectation of return or belief that you'll get a return on it, I believe can actually be very unhealthy And I'm a helper by nature, and I found myself oftentimes reflecting on how much I've given myself, given of myself, and feel like I feel crappy afterwards. And so that's the argument against altruism. I lived quite, and I would say, at least I aspired to live an altruistic life. But my definition of altruism has changed, and my belief in egoism has changed. I believe, and I guess I have adopted something a little bit more in the middle. And first of all, my belief is even Jesus Christ adopted, while it was altruistic, giving his life up, and he died on the cross. And he also, in the process of suffering for our sins, he also, in the process, became our king. Now, obviously, that's assuming that is true. I know I'm talking to an atheist here, but in the process, Christ became our king. Did he want to go through with it? No, he didn't. But he was willing, and he said, "Lord, take this cup from me, but as thou wilt, not as I wilt." And but he died for us, suffered for us, and now he's our king. He is, and he. It's interesting that in the end, it benefited him ex, extraordinarily. He is stands at the he stands supreme now. And if he hadn't performed that action, he would not be standing supreme as our Lord and Savior. He would not be our Savior, literally. And so it's interesting that it's seen as this immense altruistic giving. It's the infinite example of giving your life and even suffering, the suffering for the sins of all people and suffering all pains and afflictions. It is what it says assumed that he experienced. Yet he didn't do that without recompense. And my argument is, I'd like to parallel that. So my argument is both in favor of altruism and egoism as far as it is defined in a certain way, as far as it's defined in I'm doing something that is also benefiting me. I believe in the law of mutual benefit. And there's a book called, I believe it's called The Law of Mutual Benefit, where you do things for the benefit of yourself and others. One of the things, and oftentimes in the moment when you are suffering significantly in behalf of other people, you're also subsequently receiving some benefits after the fact. I like the one of the leaders of my church. He said true sacrifice is giving up something good for something better, which is a fascinating idea because sacrifice is hit really hard in objectivism ideas that it's really bad. But my definition of sacrifice in that case would be like I'm giving up something that I don't want to give up, but then in the end I get something better. And in that circumstance, it's actually egoistic and paradoxically, And then I think the last thing I'll say, and then I'll let you share some of your thoughts. Um, when a woman is pregnant and is going to have a baby soon, she goes through great pain to deliver that baby and to carry that baby for 9 months. She goes through significant um, hardship through it, and actually the delivery itself is incredibly painful. And but I could bet you that most women would say it was worth it, and the blessing that came from having a child that they love far outweighs those 9 months of pain and that delivery in the end, and they feel like it was by far worth it. So it's interesting because it's altruistic to be giving life to another through your pain, but in the end, you're receiving the benefits of having kids, potentially having grandkids who become your closest relationships, people you connect with your whole life and people you love. And so I believe, and I don't know if you would say that I'm not even defining altruism versus egoism, the way that you might, but that's kind of my perception of altruism versus egoism and how I've come to conceptualize the ideas in a way that they kind of work together.
Okay. Yeah, I think we would define these terms differently. So I think some of what you're describing as altruism, I would call it an investment. So you put in something like the woman, she I don't know if investment is the best term for that one, but like anytime you go to a store and you buy something, you're giving up something, right? You give the store money, but then they give you food or whatever in return. Now, is that a sacrifice? You're every time you give something up, but you get something in return. I wouldn't call that a sacrifice. I would call it a purchase or an investment. I think again, I think we have a package deal here where that sort of transaction is put in the same category as other things which are essentially different, where you're just giving something up without any expectation of something in return. That's how I would define a sacrifice, where you give up a value
Yeah,
for the sake of a non-value or a lesser value. So so the net result is that you're worse off. If that's
yeah.
your intention to be worse off, then I think you're sacrificing. But if you're giving something up with the hope that by doing that you will eventually be better off, then I would call that an investment rather than a sacrifice.
Yeah, and I think probably objectivists would argue that virtually any type of freely given service with no expectation of return um, is crazy. But some Christians might argue, well, this is helping me develop my my I don't know, my sense of self-esteem, my sense of self-worth, to develop capabilities that I can give to the world. Well, which is interesting because Nathaniel Brandon's all about self-esteem. That's his area of expertise. But it's kind of a fascinating um, idea to me that even in the purest form of, hey, I'm just giving of myself and expending of my resources and even expending of my life, in a kind of a in the way that objectivists would say, you know what, that is not good. um, some would believe, well, I'll have a reward in heaven for it, and I know that's rejected by objectivists because they don't believe there's a heaven. Um, but but it's interesting because even then, expecting some reward in heaven is isn't that also somewhat egoistic?
Yeah, I think so. I think it is an element of egoism, which is part of Christianity, and I think a more pure form of altruism would be Immanuel Kant's view, where it's not the expectation of some future reward that's should drive you. You should just do something because it's your duty. That was, I'm no Kant expert, but he had something like this idea that
Duty.
if you were motivated by some self-interest, whether it's in this life or the next life, then there's something corrupt about your motivation. For it to be a genuinely moral motivation on Kant's view, it can't be tainted by self-interest.
It's very
And
interesting.
I think heaven is an element of tainting a purely moral motivation.
Beautifully said. Sorry, go ahead.
So
Yeah, I was just
so
saying.
yeah, so I think there is some egoism as part of Christianity, but um, of course, if you don't believe in an afterlife, uh, if you don't, if you think that's something you have to take on faith that there is an afterlife, then I think you would be like, for me, it would be a sacrifice, a literal sacrifice to do things that are allegedly going to benefit me in some afterlife, since I don't believe there is an afterlife. So it would have to benefit me in my own life for it to really be a self-interested, egoistic kind of action. It's not enough to say it's going to benefit me in an afterlife.
Well said. And I actually agree very much with Immanuel Kant that you don't give with an expectation. The more you are giving purely voluntarily of your goods with no expectation of return, the more moral it becomes. And I love that idea. It's beautiful. The paradox behind it is, I think the more you really are truly giving in that way, the more you're actually going to receive as a benefit in the end. And so it's I don't know, it's kind of a fascinating idea. The more you are not expecting that return, but I also believe that sometimes people give altruistically for very unhealthy reasons. And they're doing it because they have an emotional hole where they don't feel any self-worth because their parents didn't validate them, or some other reason why they're really giving of themselves, um, in a very unhealthy way, and hoping that it's going to make them whole, and it doesn't. And I think that giving altruistically is a beautiful thing, as long as you're not doing it from this unhealthy place, and that there really is some benefits that come from it, even even if you're not acknowledging, acknowledging it, that they are coming.
I think giving without any expectation of something in return is not a good idea. I don't see the reason to do that, but I'm an egoist, so um but I do think it's important to distinguish between what could be called material and spiritual benefits. So I don't think every time you do something for someone, it has to, I don't think it has to be like a material transaction. It could just be a thank you as a form of getting something in return. Like if I give someone a gift, uh, I buy some objects for someone. I buy someone a book that I think they're going to like. Um, I don't think they need to, buy me a book, but I would at least like them to say thank you if I give
Yeah,
them this as a gift. I mean, assuming it's like a thoughtful gift, and I don't have reason to think like they hate books. They've told me they don't want objects. They're trying to declutter their house and they don't want more stuff. But um, I would hope they at least say thank you to acknowledge my thoughtfulness of them, the efforts that I put into it. And we might just call that a spiritual kind of exchange, at least going one way. Like I give them this material object and they give me some kind of recognition. They didn't give me some material object in return.
sure, sure. It could be respect. You're respecting the person more, or you're like, wow, this person's a great guy. You're getting something in return in that transaction.
Yeah, but to a case where you're giving something to someone else and you don't expect anything at all, like neither material nor spiritual, that I don't see, that doesn't seem healthy to me.
Yeah, I
That
would.
seems like a waste of one's own resources.
Yeah, um, I would say if you're doing it, like if you give your, I don't know. I don't know. I mean, some people, Christ in the scriptures, there's a man who said, "Hey, I've lived all the commandments my whole life. How can I gain eternal life?" And Christ says, "Sell all your riches, all your goods, and give all your riches to the poor, and come follow me." And the kid got all nervous and sad, and he ran away, and he left, left feeling sad. Well, Christ, he in that sense, he said, He's like saying, give up everything, give it all away. With you're not giving that stuff away. But the interesting thing is, he said, and come follow me. And assuming, with the assumption that Christ really was who he professed to be, that he really was the Son of God, would have selling all his goods and giving all his riches to the poor and following Christ really been a worthy sacrifice? And I know I'm asking an atheist here, so it's
Mhm.
kind of a hard thing to confess. But with that assumption in mind, I think that most definitely it would have been far more worth it to follow Christ and and uh, and give up all these tangible material goods. But
Well, if you get more pleasure and happiness from it, I would say, yeah, go for it. Because I think that's the ultimate value, the thing that matters most in life. Now, as a matter of fact, I don't think you would get pleasure and happiness by giving up all your material possessions. Um, and I actually think that altruism can be used as a tool of exploitation. And I think and this ties into the issue of faith. Like, I don't think there is any good reason to give away all your possessions. Um, there actually is no benefits to doing that if you're not getting anything spiritual or material from giving it up. But if you just
well,
take someone on faith and say, well, I'm gonna believe this is the right thing to do, then I mean I
yeah,
think that can get someone to do something irrational. Like if you tell them,
amen.
well, I guess there is an appeal to egoism again here. Like if you say, if you give up all your possessions and follow me, then you're going to have eternal bliss in heaven. Then again, you're appealing to self-interest.
Yeah, true, exactly. And not only eternal bliss in heaven, but you're going to be learning of me. You're going to be learning, assuming that I'm the greatest source of truth on earth. You're going to be walking around with the world's greatest um, um, person of the wisest person that exists, assuming you're following Christ. And so even in life, not just a promise of after you die, you're going to be like, wow, I might be really hungry right now and I haven't had much to eat for the last couple of days, but I far wouldn't have foregone these fundamental truths that Christ has given to me, you know. And so in those regards, you could be an egoist by following Christ.
Yeah, I can see a way that could be true. I was also thinking that you could, if you're looking at from the point of view of Christ, the one who's saying to give up your possessions, uh, you could see him as an exploiter, actually. Now, maybe Christ isn't the best example from this, but I was thinking more like in the ancient Near East, uh, there were temples, and you had to bring the offerings to the temple to the gods. You make your sacrifices to the gods. Now you could see the priests who ran the temples as parasites. They don't want to do any work in the fields and harvest the crops and pick pick the food up, and that's too much. So what I'm going to do instead, I got this clever idea. I'm going to convince people that if they bring a portion of their crops to the temple and leave it there, then they will be rewarded in an afterlife or whatever. And then, I know this is all BS. I don't believe any of this myself as the priest, but I get to mooch off of them. I'm going to eat part of their offerings that they bring to the temple.
Yeah.
And then I'm going to just, burn the rest and pretend that it's going to satisfy some supernatural God. And then the people who dropped it off of the temple, they're going to benefit in some afterlife. But I know that I don't believe any of that. So you can see the creators of the religion
Oh,
who make up this myth as exploiting the people who are actually doing things that
and
benefit
and
life.
Dan, what you just described is incredibly common for people to do. I went to Brazil last summer, just visiting, and every church there in Brazil, I mean, there's enormously rich people who are at the heads of churches, and really these church leaders all their goal is to go and just get tons of money from these people. Now, and maybe I'm not giving them the full benefit of the doubt, but my opinion is these guys are more self-interested than anything else, and they're not really helping people. And so I do believe very much that religion can become very exploitative, and that it is actually not Christian to do so. And I come from a church that we very much believe in tithing, and I believe wholeheartedly that my tithing is not being exploited, and in evil ways. And I think one of the biggest measures of that, the biggest indicators, is all of our church leaders, even up to the president of the church, are they are not receiving large sums of money that basically fund their lifestyles, and there are people in the church who basically receive a living wage to stay to be basically maintain their normal lifestyle, but they usually are leaving another career in order to be leaders within the church, and they're not doing it. They don't become rich. There's no way you can become rich in my church. The church itself has quite a large amount of money, but it's used in ways to just benefit the general population. And anyways, it's really interesting. I'm sure there'd be people who can argue like, oh no, they're totally exploiting you just like any other church. But it really comes down to what your reasonable argument is, and where, like, what, why are they and why are they not? And I don't know. It's um a hard, not an easy argument to make either way. It's there's a lot more nuance to it all.
There might be a mixture. It could be that, some people in the church are fraudsters and scam artists, and they don't believe any of it themselves, but they know they can get a lot of money out of people. And maybe there are some people who are more honest and are confused, and they actually do believe. They don't think it's all a scam, but they
Do
um,
they
so,
benefit a lot of money from it? They get a lot of money from it too.
um,
But they're
yeah,
not
there could be a
but they're not
range.
intentionally exploiting anybody. They're really kind of have a honest heart in the process, and but they're making lots of money in the process too.
Um, See, I don't know if you can like fully 100% be honest and be at least like a religious leader. I think there might be degrees here. Like if you're 5 years old, if you're 5 years old and you're brought up, you're told all the time about God, and your parents take you to church, and you believe in you believe there's a God, and you believe that someone can walk on water because your parents told you it's possible. I cut more slack for like a 5 year old who who believes in, but the older you get, I think the more opportunities there are to question things. And everyone faces a choice point in their lives of, does this make sense to me, or do I just accept this? Like, mommy or daddy tells me, such and such, but I don't really understand. That doesn't make sense to me. How can you walk on water? Every time I step in the bathtub, I go straight to the bottom. So, what's going on here?
Yeah, yeah.
And depending on how active minded you are, you could follow through with this line of questioning and continue to challenge, or you could just give up. And I think this is an issue of free will. I think people just make different choices about this. Some, they choose to maintain an active minds. Others, they just follow the herd and they kind of give up on trying to make sense of the world. And I think the longer your life goes, the more opportunities you have to either honestly face the facts or just cave in and succumb to peer pressure and your fears of social ostracism and so forth, which is why I think the older you are, the harder it is to be innocent and completely honest in your belief in a religion. So I'm not as sympathetic to, a 40-year-old who believes someone can walk in water as I am to a 5-year-old. But I think I guess, there's a continuum and degrees of innocence and honesty here.
Sure, sure.
Um,
Um, I gotta wrap up, but I just wanted to ask your opinion on something real quick, Dan. What do you think about Elon Musk and Vivek Ramaswamy closing down big departments of government?
ooh, I guess depending on the departments, I would be in favor of it or not. Like if it's the Department of Education, I've heard that one thrown around as something that one of them might close. I mean, I think education should be private. I don't think it should be a function of governments. I don't think it's right to coerce people to force people to fund a public education system or anything else for that matter. I think education is just one example of something we shouldn't be forced. So in politics, I think people should be free and not forced, which means they shouldn't be forced to pay for anything, whether it's education or healthcare or other people's retirement. So I'm in favor of privatizing Social Security, Medicare, public education. So if they want to get rid of the Department of Education as part of a way as a step towards greater freedom in the country, I would support that. But if they want to get rid of the Department of Defense because they're like pacifists or anarchists and they don't believe that the government should be using force to be our agents of self-defense, then I would oppose that abolition of a department. I mean, I think all departments should be funded by voluntary means. So even the Department of Defense, I think it should be funded by voluntary means, and there are various ways to do that, which I've talked about in other videos. So I would
Interesting.
just support it or not, depending on what exactly it is, what department it is.
I was just curious. I'm kind of excited to see what they do in government, but
And we're recording this just for anyone. I don't know when people are going to watch this, but this is shortly after Trump has been elected in 2024, hasn't yet taken office. So there's some speculation as to what might or might not happen once his second term uh, happens. So, all right. Anything else?
no, thank you, Dan. It's been a pleasure chatting with you. I like having these intellectual discussions.
Yeah, thanks for coming on. I enjoyed it. I appreciate it. And as I said at the beginning, I invite anyone else who's interested in having a chat. Feel free to get in touch with me, or if you know someone else. And also, I invite people to subscribe to my channel if you haven't already done that. I'm trying to grow that and have more of these discussions and spread the word, spread the gospel, my own gospel, as it were.
Wow, I
We
converted you already.
spread the good word, the good news. As to what you think is good news, that's what the whole debate is
Yes,
about, though.
yes.
So,
Thank you, Dan. I'd be happy to talk again if you ever would like to have another chat sometime.
all right, sounds good. Take care.
See you, Dan.
Bye bye.